right, we're live. Hello and welcome to the On the Game live stream. We are coming to you from the fourth and final day of Play the Game in Eindhoven. The last subject that we will be discussing on the live stream will be the dangers facing journalists and whistleblowers alike in the world of sports. And with us to discuss this is journalist and researcher at the Danish School of Media and Journalism and Aarhus University, Kristen Sparre.
Yes.
How are you?
I'm very fine, thank you.
Have you enjoyed Play the Game?
I have. This is my first Play the Game as a regular attendant. Previously I've been working for Play the Game, so I've always been busy doing journalism work. But this time I have been here as a normal attendee and also having the opportunity to present the paper, and it's an entirely different experience. I've had so many great conversations and learned so much.
Great. So earlier today, you said, you presented your research, and it's on violations against sports journalists.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to delve into this subject?
I can. As I told you, I have been working for Play the Game, and I was also working for Play the Game in 2005, and I was attending my very first Play the Game conference. And at this conference, there was a theme called, the protection of sports journalists, or something like that. And Jens had invited a speaker, a journalist, an editor, sports editor from Greece, to talk about his experiences of being, he actually was attacked by unknown assailants and stabbed 4 times in the back, and his theory was that it was related to sports scandals that he was covering at the time. Nobody really knows because the police never caught the perpetrators, so we don't know for sure, but he was linking these things. And this was the first time I understood that there might be a risk involved with being a sports journalist. I always thought of war correspondents being at risk, or people in conflict zones, or journalists in conflict zones, but not sports journalists. But I learned this. And then I met a number of other journalists in the course over the years that I've been working with Play the Game who have experienced violations against the media freedom or personal safety, their livelihoods. Some of the Play the Game award winners have experienced lawsuits. And I thought this is an issue, but whenever I looked around and looked at the website of media freedom organizations or in academic research, nobody talks about this. So I was forced to think, is this really a problem? Or is it just the company I keep running into these few journalists who might, actually experience problems because they're covering sports?
Right. So Play the Game kind of inspired your work?
Yes, very much so. But at the moment I'm not working for Play the Game, I'm working as an academic. So I'm outside the institution. But yes, certainly it's an inspiration that comes from working with the people in Play the Game.
And what were some of your key findings?
Well, what I did basically was that I was trying to, academics as opposed to journalists, academics do exploratory research to find out, to map an area and to find out, what's up and down in this field. So what I did was I decided I wanted to find out what kind of threats are actually leveled against journalists, or what kind of violations are perpetrated against journalists, and who are the perpetrators? Do we know anything about that? So I found something like 78 reports about incidents of violations against personal freedom or media freedom against journalists, and I started analyzing them. And what I found was that I found a lot of things, basically. But from one end, I found out that it can happen anywhere in the world. There are not certain areas that are more prone to violence than other areas. Well, violence, I say, but it's safety violations. I also found out that it seems that football has a particular problem. At least 50 out of the 78 reports that I found were, concerned with violations that took place in relation to football. Does football have a problem? A specific problem? Maybe they do. Or maybe it's because football is just one of the most widely covered sports in the world. So transgressions against journalists in this particular field of sport might also be more widely reported if they happen. I don't know, but it's an interesting finding. And then I found a whole catalogue of threats and violation of media freedom that span from denial of entry to certain events, access to press conferences, denials of visas to enter into countries where sports events are taking place, which are violations of media freedom. And then there are the threats against the safety of journalists that are it's a wide range of threats that go from verbal assaults or threats to digital assaults and threats to killings. There are examples of torture, but a lot of actual violence that also takes place in this area.
What would you say are the most common violations being perpetrated against journalists, or sports journalists?
Yes.
Specific?
I'd say if I look at my figures, physical attacks and digital attacks are the most prominent or most reported on. However, given the nature of my material, I found these reports on various websites. It might, including websites of the media, it might be that they show a bias towards violent events because violence and conflict are more normal news criteria and they're easier to spot, and maybe that gets reported more. I don't know. So at the moment, based on what I know, I'm not really sure I would like to point to one thing being more dominant than other, one threat being more dominant than other. But what I will say is that I was surprised by who was behind the attacks. Mm-hmm. Because I've been part, as I said, of Play the Game, where we have had many investigative journalists visiting. So I had a sense that maybe it would be, sports organizations, international federations, authorities in various countries that would be behind threats, and they are. But the most dangerous people for sports journalists are actually fans of sport and also athletes and coaches that they meet in the mixed zone.
Right. Earlier today, when you pointed to the fans, or on your slide, it said something about that female journalists are more prone to getting attacked by the fans. Mm-hmm. Do you want to?
Well, I was too a bit surprised about this, but there were several cases in my material that recounted how women were attacked whenever. I mean, women who act as sports journalists are an easy target, it appears, for lots of fans who are unhappy about the comments or the way that they cover sports events. And they get many comments from fans about this. There was a campaign carried out by 2 female sports journalists in the US who asked men to read out the tweets and the Facebook comments that they were getting. Not the men who had actually sent them in, but just ordinary men who didn't know the content of these messages beforehand. And you can watch how they feel, how abusive these men feel that these comments are. And in general, women are more female journalists are more at risk for attacks via social media, but sports journalists, female sports journalists, are even more so, because this is a very strong male domain where a lot of particularly male fans have strong opinions about whether these female journalists should be allowed to comment on sport.
Right. Would you say that violations against sports journalists is a pressing issue today?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there obviously is a problem. I couldn't argue that this is more pressing than violation against a number of other occupations or other groups of journalists, but it certainly is an issue. What I would also say is I think it's an underreported or unrecognized issue. In order to make a really informed opinion about whether it's pressing or not, I think we need to do more research to find out what is actually the characteristics, the parameters of these kinds of threats. I mean, so I've been doing research on 78 incidents, and that's 78 too many? Does that amount to a pressing issue? I'm not so sure. I've been talking to a number of journalists after my presentation here today, and what they've been telling me is that many of the threats against their freedom of media freedom actually come from inside their media organizations, where they experience a phenomenon called flack, which is, when they are trying to do a story and they've been interviewing sources, they experience that, heads of sports organizations phone their editors and tell their editor that this is not really a good story to get out now, and then they get the pressure from editors to stop the story. And that might in reality be a more pressing issue.
Like not self-censorship, but censorship from within the media organization.
Yes, the technical term is flack.
Yeah.
It's called flack.
Wow. You also said earlier today that you believe your research is just the tip of the iceberg.
I do.
Elaborate.
Well, the way I approached my research was that I was trying to identify incidents from, looking at websites for media freedom organizations, websites for sports journalists, and for just generally on the internet. I managed to identify these incidents. But whenever I think it's underreported. For a number of reasons. Firstly, because in a lot of the articles that I did find reported, there was also mention of other incidents in relation to the. There were other kinds of incidents similar to this. That was mentioned in the report, although they didn't give the details of them. Secondly, there are poor reporting mechanisms in this area. If you suffer a violation as a sports journalist, where do you report it so other people learn about it? Or is it in fact something you should report? So I think there's a failure to recognize the problem because you don't know what to do about it as a sports journalist who might, be exposed to something like this. Thirdly, journalism as such. A lot of reports I found on media websites. Journalism is not a very good monitoring tool because we all know when we work within journalism that it's not certain that a story will rise to the surface and actually be published. It all depends on, the people involved in making news decisions on a particular day, the kind of competition an item faces. So maybe there are many more stories out there that just didn't make it into publication. And finally, I did my research in English, and I wonder if I'd done it in a number of other languages, whether I might not have found more stories.
This is true. Are sports journalists putting themselves at risk?
Well, some are. Again, going back to my findings, my most surprising finding was that what the perpetrators that featured most were fans and athletes. So potentially, every sports journalist who go about their everyday business could be putting themselves at risk. So yes, they are.
Do the dangers that sports journalists face, do you think it affects the way that they cover sports?
I think it's a very good question, and it's one of the questions I want to look into. I'm sure it does, but I'm not sure how. If you experience, I've heard stories since after my presentation and before coming to you. I've heard stories about the kind of, approaches certain people have made to journalists, and how do you handle it if you're really threatened? Of course, it has an impact on you. How that filters into the way you approach journalism can be hard to determine without having many talks and perhaps also confidential talks with sports journalists. So the short answer is I don't know, but I think it's very likely.
Are sport journalists protected enough, do you think, from these violations?
It's a good question. I was trying to find. The question is who should protect them. Is it their employers? Should they be protected by the police, for instance, if they go to a stadium and things happen at a stadium that could endanger journalists? Should it be their trade unions? Should it be? Who should it be who are doing the protection? So the question, do you ask, are they protected enough? Yeah. Maybe not. I was trying to look more broadly, what protection of sports journalists. I did a search on this, and the only thing I found that addressed these issues were guidelines from the BBC, who were giving advice on what could happen if you go and attend a major sport event.
Right.
So there was an awareness within that organization, but I haven't come across other examples. It might be because I haven't found them yet. But it's a very good question, because who are the protectors here, and what are we protecting them from? Exactly.
And what can be done, do you think, or in your opinion, what can be done to further protect sports journalists?
Well, I would argue this, of course, but I think what we need to understand the dimensions of the problem in order to protect anyone. And in fact, the first time I presented some of my findings was at an academic conference within the auspices of UNESCO, who would, for the first time, involving academics in doing research on safety for journalists, not just sports journalists. And they were very surprised, the people I met here, that sports journalists were also being the subjects or victims of violations. So the first step is to recognize that there is a problem and understand the dimensions of the problem. That could be through academic research, but also types of research. But just that we talk about it and say that there might actually be a problem here.
Right. And on that, I think that we should end. Should we be back with a whistle stop? Should we be back with a whistle stop segment later today? Join us then, and thank you so much for joining us, Kristen. See you soon.